Welcome to the second lecture in our history unit. This lecture is going to cover the evolution of radio into television and how the two mediums kind of complemented and competed with one another. So, talking about early radio programming, we had situation comedies like Amos and Andy, and then comedy variety shows like Jack Benny. We had soap operas, and we had some game shows. And interestingly enough, these genres would later be found on, lo and behold, TV. Now, Amos and Andy was very popular for the time, but it's criticized now because of its blatant racial stereotyping. You can listen to examples on YouTube if you want. I'm not going to actually include them in this course, but just be aware that there is some very blatant racial stereotyping in there. Orson Welles made a famous broadcast in 1936. His War of the Worlds program caused quite a bit of panic. Now, the New York Times, a couple days later after his broadcast, reported that it had created a widespread panic. There's some debate over the extent of that panic, but just know that there was actual concern on some individuals' part that the world was being invaded by Martians. And who knows, maybe it was really invaded by Martians. Not really. FM radio really didn't come onto the scene until much later. Early radio was dominated mostly, at least until the 50s, almost entirely by AM. Even though a gentleman named Edwin Armstrong actually patented FM way back in 1933. Now, FM's development was sort of hindered by the push for TV. Executives in radio weren't really interested in yet another radio technology. They wanted to focus on TV, and also World War II kind of held up its development. Although it wasn't popular in its early days, by the 1960s we finally had some FM stereo, and then FM popularity began to grow. And by the early 1980s, FM had really taken over, and 75% of all listening was on FM. Unfortunately, its inventor, Armstrong, took his life in the 1950s because he just couldn't get any kind of buy-in on the part of broadcasters until much, much later. Radio network decline started occurring shortly after World War II because, of course, we had this new fancy medium called television. So network radio really starts taking a back seat. WDIA and WALK started experimenting with different music and different radio formats, and kind of made sure that radio wasn't going to die. We had R&B and a little thing called rock and roll, which you may or may not have heard of. And so radio actually managed to reinvent itself with what is known as the top 40 format, where the top 40 artists and songs were used as a set list, a playlist. And a gentleman by the name, out of Dallas actually, by the name of McClendon, was the innovator of the top 40 radio format. Okay, so looking at early TV development, there really was no single inventor. There were sort of two devices among many, but we're going to focus on two that kind of combined to help make TV possible. Philo Farnsworth invented the image dissector, which was a device that took pictures apart electronically, and then Vladimir Zworykin created what was known as the iconoscope, which was the first electronic camera tube that was usable in studios. Now, both of these technologies came out pretty close together in the 1920s. I believe it was 1922 for the dissector, and then 1923 for the iconoscope. But TV didn't really debut as a technology until 1939 at the World's Fair. And so it took a while to get the technology developed, and then broadcasting standards were set in 1941. Again, the development of, like FM, was kind of held up by World War II, but then after World War II, the technology really took off, and it kind of started supplanting radio as the dominant broadcast medium. In fact, since its debut in adoption in like 1941, until 1948, it became so popular that the TV audience had grown by 4,000%. Now, in the early days, when TV was first created, there were only 13 channels. And it soon became apparent that that just was not enough. And so with the FCC's 6th report and order in 1952, it created UHF band, which unfortunately the UHF band stations lagged behind because the signals were inherently weaker. They had a hard time competing with VHF, very high frequency. UHF is ultra high frequency. And manufacturers weren't even required to equip UHF on new sets until '62. Now, color standards, a color system was agreed upon by the major network, the TV networks, in 1953, but programming, all-color programming wasn't really prevalent until the 1960s, and even then, we didn't have but half of the TV sets in 1972 in the country, only half of them were color. So it took a while for color to take off, but of course now we have beautiful high def as well as beautiful color. The big three networks, economics pretty much in the beginning seemed to favor no more than three major networks. NBC, of course, and CBS, and then the FCC told NBC to sell off, remember, its blue radio networks. Well, it actually had blue TV as well, a blue TV network, excuse me, which the FCC told it to sell, and it became ABC in 1948. There was a fourth stage network called Dumont. It only lasted less than 10 years, and it just couldn't compete with the other three because it just didn't have the financial capabilities that the other three had. The golden age of TV was really before videotape in the mid-50s, and most programs at that point were live. There was really no cost-effective way to record and play back programs in the early days. So at this point, there were many original plays on TV that kind of targeted a urbane, educated audience. But there was also programming for a more broad appeal, such as the Sid Caesar show, excuse me. And of course, I Love Lucy was a very popular show, and it was a pioneer in that it was one of the few programs that was actually shot on film, which made reruns possible. With reruns came the possibility of more revenue later, advertising revenue. So television started maturing through the 50s, and along came videotape recording, so that reruns and more advertising dollars were even more prevalent. We had women and minorities become more predominant as performers. Nat King Cole was a pioneer. Not only did he have an amazing voice, but he was the first African-American performer to host a network show in 1956. We actually do have some YouTube clips that'll be available for you to watch. Like I said, highly enjoyable listening to his voice. And then network or TV news kind of came to the forefront with the coverage of the JFK assassination in 1963. And so more and more people were turning to news, to TV to get their daily news. Some other television notables, well, Fox actually managed to join the big three, and lo and behold, we could sustain four networks, TV networks. So Fox was launched in 1985 by businessman Rupert Murdoch, and it acquired rights to NFL games in '94 and actually managed to reach the top of primetime ratings in '96. So that was a huge accomplishment for Fox. Other networks came along like UPN and WB, which they came along in '95. They merged to form the CW in 2006. And then we had the digital transition of both TV and radio. TV transitioned in 2009. All TV is now broadcast digitally. And HD radio also leads in the radio digital age. And it currently reaches 94% of the population on regular radio. But unfortunately, time spent listening has declined about 19%. So that's it for the second lecture of the history unit. Join us for the next one, number 3.